Welcome to yet another edition of the brand called You. Today I have an incredibly successful professional, someone who I've held in very, very high regard for a long period of time. Barun Mohanty, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks, Ashutosh.
Thank you. Barun is the former MD International of the Michael and Susan Dell Foundation. He spent many, many years with McKinsey before that. He's from IIT Delhi and he's an MBA from Canada. So, Barun, tell me a little bit about your early life and your early career.
Sure. I grew up here in Delhi and pretty much like a regular Delhi person. My parents were very focused on making sure that we worked hard, and all of that happened. I think a couple of things that I remember from that time, which has sort of helped me in my career, was my father had a very open mind, and he encouraged me from my childhood to listen to others, absorb what I wanted, and then do what I wanted, but to make the effort to listen first. And growing up in India, and I realized this more as I've lived overseas, we tend to want to shout above each other. And I kept that in mind. And I joined McKinsey in Toronto after doing my MBA at UBC in Vancouver. And when I did that, and that was early, I was very naive and innocent. I'd grown up here, very sheltered as we were in those days, very average middle class background. I just found initially I was totally intimidated by the extraordinarily smart people who were there at the firm. And I felt out of place. I thought they had made a mistake. But I hung in there and I found that, I could also learn from them. So I'll give you an example. Within, I think, my first week of joining McKinsey in Toronto, there was some research to be done on a particular company, and they roped me in, and they had 2 or 3 other people doing it. And there was some problem that had to be solved. Growing up in India, I was, of course, quickly done and dusted within a couple of hours. I had an answer, I had a solution, I knew how to get the problem fixed. Meanwhile, my colleagues were like, "Oh, wow, you finished early, that must be really good." But they said, "We're not ready." And so these guys took another couple of days to come back with some solutions I never thought were possible. And I learned, that was one I've learned many times, how do you actually look at a problem from a variety of different ways? So anyway, lots of learnings along those lines.
So, after so many years in consulting, what made you shift to the social sector? It's a big shift.
It is. I think some of that goes back to sort of my roots and how I grew up. I've always grown up with a very clear idea that I want to do something for my country. I think that is something that has stayed with me. I think my mother in particular embedded that in me. And till today, my ultimate loyalty lies to doing something for India. I had no idea what that meant when I was growing up. We were in the battle for, doing better than everybody else, competitive, all that stuff.
Correct.
And so, I can give you lots of examples. So when I finished my MBA at UBC in Vancouver, I came back to India because I wanted to do something here. Circumstance in some ways, and my marriage took me back to Canada. And so I started with McKinsey. But again, I was very keen very quickly to bring McKinsey to India. And I was part of the team, very early team that actually set up McKinsey's offices in India. So there's always been that, let me try and find a way to do something. At a particular time when I joined the foundation, we were living in Portugal also with McKinsey. And we had a tragedy in our family. And that got me thinking, and it changed our lives in many, many ways. And I kept looking then for, so the next opportunity should be something where I can focus my mind outside of this tragedy and do something with it. And, I was very fortunate that Michael Dell was looking for starting the foundation in India. I grabbed it and ran with it.
And you've done some amazing work. So let's talk about the Michael and Susan Dell Foundation.
Sure.
Tell me a little bit about the kind of work the foundation is doing here in India?
When we started the foundation's work in India in around 2005, 2006, I had the privilege of actually being the employee number one.
Correct.
But I also had a bit of a baggage of not knowing absolutely anything about development. And I think therein lies a little bit of how the foundation got going. And I used a little bit of the management type principles that I had learned through my work at McKinsey. So things like, if you do something, there has to be a result. I mean, this is stating the absolute obvious.
Correct.
But then how do you know what results you've had? And so I was fired by that for a lot. And my experience, and I talked to everybody. I mean, my entire start was about learning from others. And I was learning I was drinking out of a fire hose.
Wow.
And I learned that if you measure something. So I think that has stayed with the foundation. So we said we'll help children living in urban poverty improve their life outcomes. And we interpreted that, and Michael and my boss in Austin, Janet, who ran the entire foundation, was very clear that we want to help children, but in measurable ways. And we wanted to do it through education, to make sure that they had livelihoods and jobs, and that there was financial security. So we pushed along all of those in India, lots of experiments, lots of failures. But I think the foundation today, and as you mentioned, I just retired at the end of December last year. The foundation is still very focused on that, trying to help children at scale, improve quality of their outcomes, of their learning outcomes, get them jobs and livelihoods, and provide financial security for them.
Amazing. And you're doing a lot of great work in education.
Well, I think education has been the soul of the foundation. I think that is where the founders, Michael and Susan, were truly intrigued with how can we help children.
Okay.
And that has been the mainstay of the foundation for a long time. In India, I think we started by working with NGOs and learned a lot and worked with them to actually see what it takes to make a difference. And I think today, the foundation in India, and Geeta Goyal, who runs it so incredibly well, is focused on the same values, which is how do you try to break the deep inequity that's in our society and try and provide a way in which children, no matter where they come from, have the opportunity of an outstanding education. And you measure what happens along the way. So I'll tell you something that I think drives the foundation, and this is what I have always really believed in, that the gene of inequity is okay, runs deep in, I would say, all of us, all Indians. We've grown up blind to inequity that happens elsewhere. And ultimately, to change the outcomes of children who've grown up in poverty, you need to have a real strong focus on saying inequity is not okay. And we have to start them off equal in as much as you can. Easier said than done. Even professionals like us, I think, if we are truly fired by making that change, we say that when we're at work, and sometimes we go back and live in a world where you ultimately exploit the poor. So that, understanding that, then you realize how hard it is to make these changes. And so we eventually realized that unless you can make it happen and focus on the success of large government systems, where large numbers of children actually demonstrate and prove that they are doing better, it'll be very hard to make a change that sticks. So one thing is to make a change. The second thing is to make it at scale. The third is to then measure it and make sure that it's running well. And the fourth is how do you make that stick in a system where inequity is rife everywhere? And the pressure on keeping poor kids learning well and doing well in life is very low from the people who are running that system. I mean, that is the fundamental issue. And so I think the foundation's work today, in education in particular, tries to deal with that. I'll give you an example. after a lot of effort and with the good cooperation of the Haryana government, I think a lot of progress has been made in learning outcomes of all children studying in school in Haryana. And our team, the foundation team, has done an extraordinary piece of work. There's been a lot of collaboration with others and so on. So last year, they did quite well. It was called Saksham Haryana, and they did very, very well. And then the question arose, okay, so for the past 3 or 4 years, we made this happen. It was done in campaign mode. The chief minister led it. There were a lot of people who put serious effort into it. But what happens going forward? How, and this was a debate inside the foundation, and I was very much part of that, saying, how do we make sure that this sticks? In the context of the India that I just described to you, if we go, will things go back to what they were? There may be a bit of a hysteresis loop, and some things will remain, but it may not stay as hard. And that's where I think talented people can come up with solutions on how do you make something stick. So the path that we discussed were maybe you can put in some scholarships and prizes based on academic performance at junior levels in school, such that you can create some excitement amongst the parents and the teachers and the children, of course, even if it's a small token, a small prize, small scholarship, whatever it is, but it's publicized in the neighborhood, in the villages, in the districts to say, this school had 3 children who got this prize. Immediately, it puts the parents saying, hey, something good is going on in my school. That's one dynamic. The other schools which didn't get it are talking about, oh, they got it. And then they're saying, why aren't we getting it? The teachers know, and the principal and the district officials know that this is something that's happening. So the point is to keep subliminal and sometimes subtle and sometimes extreme pressure on the system to deliver against it. And incentive really works. So, that kind of problem solving, I think, is an essential part of making change in a system which has not been that confident or has been successful.
Very interesting. So, Barun, you mentioned that one of the things that you look for when you are investing in all the children is that it has to be measurable.
Right.
My question to you is, how do you define measurable? Is it more grades? Is it more number of children? Is it more awards being given in multiple schools? What is measurable?
So I think it's a very good question. And I think so for me personally, I think the concept that you measure something, whatever be the measure, immediately has the effect I was talking about earlier.
Absolutely.
Which is half the battle is won when people know that there is some measurement going on. Let me step even further back. If I look at our society, accountability and taking responsibility for oneself is not the most shining example that comes to mind in India. Translucency, opaqueness is something that I think, sadly, many of our people have hidden behind. And I think the central question, so Indians are really smart. There's a lot of smart people. There's a lot of really good qualified teachers out there, extraordinary administrators. So why isn't that all working? You can have lots of different theories about it, but if you start to peel the onion there, and there's many layers in the education system and many other systems, it's not that difficult to understand that accountability. I think in some of our work with different parts of the government, and also in the private sector, we were asking, so who's responsible for children's learning outcomes? Surely there must be somebody. Maybe that's not a position that gets a lot of importance, but somebody, and there's nobody. There's nobody. There's people for distributing books, and it's not anybody's fault, but that's just how our society is. So I think I caught on pretty early, and I had these interesting discussions where, I would ask, I think Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan was just starting up when I had moved to India then in 2005, and I was in secretaries' offices and various functionaries' offices, and they were all focused on, appropriately, I think, on making sure that new schools were built and children were coming to school. And I was asking them, what about what happens in school? And what do the children learn? And how do you know? And where are the results? And in some people got offended at the question. It just wasn't not the main thing. And today, I think one of the things that we have helped contribute to is that people are asking more about, okay, so what happened? What is the outcome? What was the quality? So I haven't directly answered your question just yet, but I think the backdrop of this notion of measurement is so important. Measurement, transparency, and then the discussion of what it means, not blaming somebody, but look at so what I've always said is it's not only okay to measure, but always look at the delta. Correct. What's happening? What's changing? Yeah. And how can we influence that? Correct. What is the effectiveness of that change? So I started with that. And then early on in some of our NGO work, I was insistent that when we give money to an NGO for anything, for the best of worlds, we need a third-party objective scientific assessment. Correct. I didn't know what it was. I had no idea, and there's a lot of debate. What is the right thing to measure? Can you measure this versus that? Should it be a randomized control trial? Should it be X, Y, and Z? And the foundation's philosophy was very much, let the experts tell us. If we've used the wrong measure in the past, we'll change it. We're not tied to anything. We're tied to best practice that's available. Let's use it. Correct. But let's absolutely measure how people are improving. So then we came to this situation where we were seen very quickly as the measurement people. And there's many examples where then the government was looking for NGO support in, say, in a place like Mumbai and various other places. And the only NGOs which had any data were the ones that we had funded, which was ironic because that's not what they imagined it would be. So there's lots of stories on measurement, but I think the fundamental thing is if you do something, you've got to understand what the effect of that is. And in fact, our Nobel laureates from earlier this last year have made that into their main work, their thesis, that you've got to understand the effect of it. And they've taken it to a really high level, but that's what's driven us.
Understand. So let's move on. A lot of the investments that the foundation was making was in NGOs and startups. Yeah. As someone who has looked at multiple NGO startups, my question to you is that what are some of the basic mistakes a lot of these entrepreneurs, if I can use that term a little loosely, of course, make?
So I'll give you again, a bit of the background from which we came to these things. So we wanted to make change in children and youth's lives and families' lives. And we said, we can't just follow one path. We've got, one of my personal tenets has always been, you have to get the best brains in the world.
Absolutely.
Who are also wise to do this type of work. And I found when I first came here, and it wasn't an industry or an area where the conditions were right to attract the best brains. So then, in addition to working with NGOs, and we were trying to break into government at that time, into state governments and central government, we said, what other levers are there? How can we get money and talent into this? And clearly, market-based mechanisms make sense. So it was quite a revolutionary idea 5-6 years ago, or 7-8 years ago, when we actually pushed through. And our first experience was with the urban microfinance organizations, Jana Lakshmis and Ujjivans and so on. And when we funded them, they were at the nascent stage. Nobody knew if they would work. People would say urban microfinance wouldn't work because you needed a rural bonding and so on and so forth. And our approach was anything that can attract top talent and also capital might have a good opportunity to work. So the learnings that we got, so one of the lenses we looked at from the foundation's perspective was, is it actually benefiting the poor?
Okay.
So that I mean, microfinance was one thing. It was much easier to actually understand that because it was a financial market. Financial markets are well understood. But in education, it's not so clear. Results take a long time. And very often, parents, schools, teachers are taken in by the razzle and dazzle of the solution that they are being provided. So, if your question is how did we figure out, which ones to support, I think we learned. But one of our filters was demonstrate to us how it's helping the poor, and what are the outcomes that you can measure. You'd be surprised. 90% got eliminated in that, and then there were a few left, and we went after the ones which were really good after that.
And you were able to then evaluate the ones that you funded,
Yes,
that there was a
Absolutely.
demonstrable improvement
absolutely.
in the lives of children.
That was the core currency to enter our office. I mean, we never changed that. We, in the market-based environment, we also realized that the poor who are buying those services will only buy if they see the benefit.
Correct.
So there was an additional major, which is the beauty of market-based systems, right? We also realized later on, though, while that is true, some of the underprivileged people do not always understand how to see the value of something. And so we had to play a middle role there to make sure that the outcomes actually made sense. So it wasn't just the new shiny object they were paying for. It's a complex area, but it's done remarkably for what we've been able to accomplish.
So, Barun, after such an amazing career that you've had, not just in India and overseas, as you look back at life, what have been some of your learnings from people who may have had an influence on your life?
I think, and I touched upon this at the beginning as well. I mean, my parents have had a massive influence, and that is true for almost everybody in their own lives. But I think in two specific ways which have stayed with me. I mean, my father, I think, apart from all the other things about working hard, looking after yourself in a way that was correct, left me with this thing about keep an open mind, listen to others, and then make up your own mind, but keep that open mind very open and shut up and listen. And growing up in this environment, that has made a difference. And my mother was very passionate and driven about ambition, and she was very ambitious even though she came from a poor background. And I think that stayed with me, that I need to stay ambitious. But the third one is interesting. One of the people who helps lead the India office for McKinsey, Tino Puri, close friend and has been a real good mentor to me, taught me, Tino, a very smart guy, but taught me one very interesting thing, which is no matter how complex a problem, simplify it, look at it in a very simple way, and all your confusion will go away. And I'll give you an example. When we were, I remember in the absolute early years of starting McKinsey in India, we were doing a proposal for a very large bank in the country. And none of us knew very much about banking and so on. And I remember one day I was asking Tino, there's so many problems here. He said, Barun, someone once told me, banking is very easy. Borrow cheap and lend dear, and all your problems will go away. And at one level, that's a bit facetious, but I think the message is right. And I've always tried. Anytime I'm debating something and I'm saying, I don't really get it, go back to the basics, go back to the fundamentals, and then things become clear.
Fantastic. So, Barun, my last question to you, and this question I ask from every guest. It's a question on failure. We all fail as Indians, particularly, and I think Asians in general. We don't teach our children that it's okay to fail, and yet we fail all the time.
Right.
So my question to you is, what have been some of your learnings from some of your mistakes or your failures?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm all about failures, and have failed more often than I care to always admit, even to myself. On the topic of failure, very briefly, I remember again once at our during my McKinsey days. We had a session with one of the top economists of the world, and he described the whole thing about failure. And he said, why do you think so much innovation comes? And this was 20 years ago, from the Silicon Valley area and not from elsewhere. Anyway, his point was pretty much the same, that, if you go farther east, people are killing themselves if they fail. Europe, it's sort of tolerated, whereas in America, you wear it as a badge of honor. That stuck with me. And so I've always looked at failures as something that you should take something away from and never repeat it, but celebrate it and talk about it. Easier said than done. But I mentioned to you earlier about this thing about, my early instincts. And even today, I have to fight those of rushing in, solving a problem and saying, done, please, where is my 100% marks?
Correct.
Whereas a much wiser way to do it is to think about it from a 360 degrees.
Correct.
If you have one solution, put it away, but think about 5 others. So that's one. The other thing I remember, again, because McKinsey was sort of like an MBA for me, I remember doing a deck for my engagement manager in the Toronto office. I went and I showed it to him and we went through it, and then he said, okay, but work on a couple more things and come back with it. I went back to my office, and then I remembered, but there's a specific page in there I really need. So I went back to his room and I asked him for the deck back. And this guy, Greg, I remember him, he slightly sheepishly took it out of the waste paper bin. And, that really shocked me. And I realized he thought my writing was so poor. One of the things I've learned from that was that we must be able to communicate better.
Correct.
And I used to be, so I was the double problem. I thought I communicated really well and wrote really well. And I didn't understand the importance of actually doing it well. So I made it a point to focus on some of those types of things. I mean, there are many other lessons
That's
from
fantastic. That's fantastic. So, Barun, thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you. And I know you've had an incredible innings, and I wish you lots of success in all the exciting things you're going to do now onwards.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed being on your show.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You podcast. Be sure to visit tbcy.in to join the conversation, access show notes, and discover fantastic bonus content. You can follow us on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Simply search for The Brand Called You. Thank you, and see you next week.